Hello, everyone. Today we are going to discuss post colonialism and deconstruction in relation to Edward Said, Homi Bhabha, and Gayatri Spivak. Now, post colonialism. Colonialism refers to the practice and exploitation and control of colonized people and their lands. And post colonialism is the academic study of colonialism and imperialism, focusing on the consequences. It is concerned with the economic, cultural, and psychological effects of imperialism and emancipation from colonial rule. Post colonial literature and criticism came into being during and after the struggles of many nations in Latin America, Africa, Asia, and in many parts for independence from colonial rule. Post-colonial studies has been gaining prominence since 1970s, especially with Edward Said's Orientalism, which was written in 1978, and then a series of influential articles by Homi Bhabha and Gayatri Spivak. Post-colonial literary studies consider writing from colonizing people, colonized people, and increasingly formerly colonized people. The colonizing nations are sometimes described as metropolitan. Well, decolonization, so it is the act of getting rid of colonization and the liberation of the colonized. I have an example like in India. India was occupied by British, and in 1947 it got independence. So the act of getting rid of colonization and the liberation of the colonized, we call it decolonization. So, after the Second World War in 1945, many countries dismantled colonial government or imperial powers like Britain, France, Belgium, Japan, Netherlands, etc., and its entire social system, which control and exploitation were based. Here goes post colonialism. The colonies are sometimes divided into three different kinds. The first is the occupational colonies. It is also called exploitation colonies or colonies of conquest. The colonies remain a small proportion of the population. They leave their metropolitan homes to do their work of exploiting the colony, and they return home and other colonizers replace them. Example like colonial India and Nigeria. Second, we have the settler colonies. The colonizers move in permanently, and they or their descendants often grow far more numerous than the people they colonize. The settlers often act like occupiers and identify with their metropolitan homeland. So we have a few examples here: Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the United States. Internal colonies, sometimes the settlers forcibly or culturally limit outnumbered indigenous people to specific areas where they are surrounded by settlers. We have Indian reserves, South African Bantustans, and somewhat urban ghettos. Neocolonialism. Well, as you all know, post colonialism leads to neocolonialism. So, after the decolonization of many countries, particularly African nations that had been subjected to European rule, there was a continuing affiliation between colony and colonizer. In many countries, local oligarchs and dictators betrayed the promise of the independence by producing many of the abuses of colonialism, including the concentration of capital and resources in a few privileged hands. undemocratic government, ethnic and racial demagoguery, restriction on speech and civil liberties. This now represented not only by the colonist government but also by colonialist international cooperation, often turning the rage for globalization into colonialism under another name, splitting the profits between the local oligarchs and the colonial power. So, this is new colonialism. Another aspect of post colonialism is hybridity. When colonizing people moved to the lands they colonized, and when so many millions of people from colonized and formerly colonized countries migrated to the metropole and to formerly colonized countries due to forced displacement, economic disaster, pressure of war, or in search of economic and educational opportunities, they arouse a certain mixing of people and culture. The diaspora of migrants contribute to the fusion of different cultures, which resulted in cultural hybridity. So, hybridity is the negotiation of the original and host culture. Now, a negritude. So, negritude is a literary and political movement developed by Francophone intellectuals of the African diaspora during the 1930s to raise awareness of the blacks. The European colonizers saw the people they colonized as barbaric, but the writers of negritude reversed their view and saw the European colonizers as a true barbarians. How did they do it? By writing back. The year 1950 saw the publication of seminal texts of post-colonialism. We have Wole Soyinka, a Nigerian playwright and Nobel Prize laureate. He says, "A tiger does not proclaim his tegritude, he pounces." We have Gugi, a Kenyan, says that African writers should stop writing in European languages. We have Chinua Achebe. He wrote Things Fall Apart. He writes not in British but in African English. Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Mask. Please read this, you will understand more. So, another important figure is Frantz Fanon. Is one of the most provocative and influential theorists and practitioners of anti-colonial resistance. Deconstruction in relation to Edward Said, Homi Bhabha, and Gayatri Spivak. So my first discussion I have put here is Orientalism, which is very important. So Edward Said's Orientalism, which was written in 1978. But today, I'm not going to focus more on Orientalism. Please go to my previous video, which I have discussed enough about Orientalism and deconstruction. So please go to my previous video. So let's move to Gayatri Spivak. So Gayatri Spivak. So Gayatri Spivak is a post-colonialist theorist, is also a Marxist feminist deconstructionist. She wrote the book Can a Subaltern Speak? Like Edward Said, she tries to overthrow the binary opposition between self and other, Occident and Orient, center and marginal, subject and object. Subaltern is a term refers to the people with less power. Spivak's examples of subalterns are women, especially Indian women. According to Spivak, subaltern means who belong to the third world countries, and because they are divided by class, gender, religion, etc., it is impossible for them to speak, and these divisions do not allow them to stand up in unity. So she deconstructs the Western view and argues that Western ideology is structured by the West. It is produced in order to support their economic interest. She says in a later piece, she is a subaltern and speaks perfectly well. She resists essentialism, the belief that certain people or entities share some attributes that are necessary to its identity and function. Spivak has also invited cultural critics who usually look skeptically at essentialism to experiment by making their resistance to essentialism more flexible. She calls it strategic essentialism. Sati or Suti. So this word, you find it in her book, Can a Subaltern Speak? So sati is a Hindu practice of widow burning. British colonialists often saw themselves not just as conquerors, but as good liberal conquerors. Their liberalism told them that widow burning was abhorrent and needed to be halted. Their solution was to say that widows could only be burned if they agreed to be burned. When a widow says that, yes, she wants to be burned, who is speaking? Is she speaking for herself, or has she been so absorbed into patriarchal culture that she speaks for the patriarchy, even if she believes that she speaks for herself? Now, Homi Bhabha's hybridity. He joins the critique of Said's Orientalism as overly binarized. He describes the colonized and colonizing worlds as hybrid, a synonym for cultural multiplicity. To some critics, it means a term for cross-breeding two different species, which can carry inappropriately biological connotations and seem to reinstall the binary the term supposedly undermines. Regardless, the cultural multiplicity suggested a sense of cultural change across history that colonialist and some anti colonial movements might seem to deny. Now, mimicry. Mimicry is another key concept of hybridity. So, Bhabha's concept is closely derived from ideas and terminology from Freud and French thinkers like Derrida and Lacan. So, colonized people often end up mimicking the colonizers, adopting the colonizers' language, educational system, clothing, music, etc. So, when the colonizers gaze in the mirror of the colonized mimicry, the image they see looks, as Bhabha puts it, almost the same but not quite. The blend of repetition and difference can threaten the colonizers' sense of their own power and superiority. Gugi's critique of African writing in European languages also provokes ambivalence and doubt in the colonizers. So, this is an example of mimicry.